Day 6. 0000 hours to 0400 hours. The Major walked around the room. There had been 2 more murders. The victims lay dead in the apartment. Although many people were being killed daily in the Civil War, this was an unusual crime. One of the victims was the opposition leader. The other victim was the main suspect in the ritualistic murders. Apart from the identity of the second victim, there seemed to be no connection with his investigation. Last night's murders had not been bizarre slayings. Both victims had been shot a number of times by an antique revolver, known to have belonged to one of the victims. The gun was missing. After his speech the night before in the academy, Brown had become an extremely unpopular figure amongst the ruling elite. His assassination was predictable, although how the murderer passed by the android security guards had yet to be explained. Carlson could think of no reason why Bulbir Singh Mann should be the target of assassins. Presumably he had been in the way. Although Carlson felt there was some connection with the chaos and anarchy erupting over the Althosian system, he was sure none of the Freedom Party supporters would have devised such a ruthless method for annihilating the elite. He wondered if Brown had been murdered by the military. Carlson looked over the academician's desk. An almost finished game of snakes and ladders was laid out amongst top-secret briefing papers. One of the counters had fallen down a snake to the bottom of the pit. Copy Ion looked at the sprawled body of the academician. "Cover it up," he ordered one of the androids. Carlson had been wondering for some time what was actually going on. Copy Ion had expressed a great deal of interest in these killings, but had not passed on all the information available to him. Even now, with Nicaea descending into a maelstrom of violence and recrimination, the head of the Justice Police was concentrating his energies on a series of grisly murders. General Copy Ion showed little interest in the events of the Civil War, even with confirmed reports of a hover train being hijacked and 2 female academicians having their homes broken into and being raped by soldiers. Carlson wondered if Copy Ion knew which side he was on and was trying to remain neutral in the conflict. The Major pointed to a white substance on the floor. "What do you think it is?" He bent over to scrape some of the substance off the floor. "Don't touch it," warned Copy Ion. "Whatever it was, it came from this book. See? The cover has been forcibly removed." Carlson showed his superior a torn book, which had been thrown into the waste disposal. "It's drugs," said Copy Ion. "Man is a black market dealer, who it's believed has been smuggling drugs into Nicaea." "What? You didn't mention this before?" Carlson was increasingly irritated with his superior officer. "You aren't the only member of the Justice Police," Copy Ion replied in a cold, dry manner, as if rehearsing a speech. "We've been investigating this drug ring for some months. Annalisa Sellen was one of the undercover officers responsible for the operation. It was believed someone from the Academy was helping Man with the finance and distribution of the drugs. We've discovered who that was. I suggest the investigation is now closed." Copy Ion walked off. He stopped to let the body of his friend Brown be taken past him. As the stretcher passed by, he pulled back the blanket. He uttered something under his breath, let the blanket drop, and hobbled down the steps. Carlson watched him. There were many questions which the General had failed to answer in his summary of these crimes. Who had killed Brown? Where were the drugs now, and what was the purpose of the ritualistic murders? The investigation was far from over. Torrential rain was drowning the countryside. The Doctor and Blake sat on the side of a hill watching the bones being carried from the archaeological dig to a large mechanical transporter. Due to their weight and size, the ancient fossils were handled with military precision as they were placed inside the monstrous fire-breathing cart. Blake was very wary of the snorting machine, which his travelling companion described as a juggernaut. The machines made their own bilious sound, which drowned the natural noise of the earth. The Doctor stood up, taking in the distant sights of the Great Plain. Blake recited the 2 lines of his poem, Milton. And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green? Rain ran down his face. He had not imagined, when he had written the poem 4 years before, that he would ever be standing here thinking of the fall of man. The archaeologist was directing the loading of the bones. The doctor walked over to him. The rain made the lifting slippery and dangerous. "Why did you start digging here?" the doctor asked. Roberts looked nervous, but kept a fixed smile. "You were looking for the creature," the doctor realized. "You knew it was here." Roberts walked away. How could you have known where it was?" The unit soldiers continued to load the bones. The task took some considerable time, as each bone was labelled according to a blueprint held by the archaeologist. The doctor paced around the excavation, measuring the depth and imprint of the relics. He seemed to be looking for something. Blake suspected that it was a strand of memory. "This is all wrong," he shouted out, as the doors of the juggernaut were sealed. Bernice had never been down so many corridors before she met the doctor. It appeared to be an occupational hazard, walking down dark and dingy, or even brightly lit, corridors, waiting for strange creatures to pounce out at unexpected moments. She was actually becoming quite blasé about the dangers lurking on their travels. She walked through the space station shouting, "Yoo-hoo, we're here!" and opening long forgotten cupboards and going, "Boo!" Spike looked at her as if she was a complete idiot. The space station was dead. It was a broken hulk, millennia of dust particles covering the displays and floors. A complex lighting system had once worked, but now the only illumination was from the gaps in the roof, which allowed streams of sunlight to pour through into the empty, lifeless environment. There appeared to be miles of corridors, intersecting, crisscrossing, and going nowhere. Certain parts of the station seemed to have been attacked and ripped apart. Most of the handles and doors had been removed, and mounds of bones seemed to be in their place. Spike said that it looked like hunters had attacked the craft. "What are hunters?" Bernice asked. "They are a hostile race of parasites, which raid unprotected interplanetary craft, attack lone colonists, abduct small children and animals," Spike said. "The Justice Police's main task is to protect the colony worlds from these creatures." "You've met these creatures?" Bernice asked. "Yes, many times. I once had to have a leg replaced when a couple of hunters tore mine off. I once defended a small village on Trieste from over 100 of these things. There were 20 people, including children, in this new colony, and they were all slaughtered. When we first arrived, the hunters existed in far greater numbers and were suicidal in their assaults on some of our military attack ships. They were controlled, though." Bernice didn't like the sound of this. "Controlled?" "Bacteriological weapons. They wiped out the majority of them. Within a couple of years, only a few hundred of them survived. Unfortunately, they have continued to breed." Bernice looked again at the bones. "What are they like?" "Big, hairy wings and lots of teeth. In hand-to-hand combat, it would take 2, perhaps 3 androids to subdue just one of them. And I say subdue. I am like a David to their Goliath. We need advanced weaponry to destroy them." "Friendly creatures, then?" Bernice asked. "It is said they can smell blood many kilometers away." Spike sounded terribly bitter in his description of the hunters, as if he had a personal stake in their destruction. "Out here on the frontiers of space, there are many dangers." Spike carried on walking down the faceless, uniform corridor. The initial radio message had beggared belief. An aeroplane, carrying over 500 passengers, had reported that they were under attack. On the slow descent to Bristol Airport, a creature had attached itself to one of the wings. 2 more of the creatures hovered around the craft, walking over the wings and flashing their teeth at the hysterical passengers. They then began to play a game which involved tearing pieces off the aircraft and hurtling them at each other. Passengers were screaming and shouting. Blake could hear the pilot demanding advice and assistance, knowing that it would never come. Unit had been routinely monitoring the signals in the area and had picked up the SOS messages from the passenger aircraft. The ground control asked the crew to describe the creatures, bat-like, horrible, and then the sound went dead. The plane had gone into a steep descent, and an explosion ripped the air. Blake and the doctor travelled with the unit personnel in 2 Land Rovers towards the crash site. The Juggernaut followed behind at a more respectable pace through the waterlogged Wiltshire countryside. The torrential rain made driving hazardous. They had been heading back towards London when the strange conflict in the sky had been picked up by Unit. Blake knew that the creatures were the spawn of hell. It was the voices coming from the little boxes, and the concept of man flying between America and England in a few hours that he found difficult to grasp. The doctor's vague descriptions of bits of wire conducting sound waves through the air and speed allowing gravity to be defeated only succeeded in confusing the poet. He knew the doctor was trying to be helpful, but it was all too unbelievable. The Land Rover ride made him feel nauseous. Travelling at a speed of 100 miles an hour made him worry that he would leave the safety of God's earth. He closed his eyes and thought of the nature of the world, the past and the future. The world of the 20th century was more alien to him than the more recognisable vision of hell. The journey finished at the fallen aircraft. Although parts were scattered over the surrounding fields, the main body of the plane had landed in one piece. The doctor said it was a miracle that the pilot had managed to steer the plane down at all. In a field in the middle of the countryside, ambulances and fire engines, with droning sirens and flashing blue lights, watched helplessly as the demons continued to attack the half-destroyed plane. Passengers screamed, but the hunters, now increased in numbers to 20 or 30, flew down and sank their claws and teeth into the injured and dying. The colonel ordered his men to line up and commence rapid fire, but the 20th century weaponry failed to combat the creatures. They treated it as a game. As the creatures soared up and down, their laughter began to take on an eerie and mournful tone. The Juggernaut arrived. The soldiers escorting it used their weapons to help destroy the creatures. Men and women from the ambulances risked their lives to rescue tormented souls. Some were immediately picked up by the demons, whilst others managed again and again to risk their lives before falling to the persistent attacks of the creatures from hell. Blake wanted to go and help, but was stopped by the doctor. "We have to go," the doctor said, pointing to the Juggernaut. Blake looked at the traveller with surprise. The doctor had no intention of intervening to prevent further loss of life. "There's no more we can do," the doctor hinted at an apology. "We must return those bones to the other world." The traveller strode off towards the Juggernaut. The soldiers had moved closer to the aeroplane, desperately trying to fight the flying demons. "Can you drive one of these?" the doctor asked. "No," replied Blake. "Never mind. I've always wanted to have a go." The doctor's response gave the poet no confidence, but choice was limited. He either went along with the doctor, or he remained behind. It was the lesser of two evils. "Going somewhere?" The archaeologist appeared from the back of the Juggernaut. He was smiling, but holding a gun out in front of him. His eyes seemed glazed over, and the smile was stretched and impenetrable. "There's no point in me explaining what you've actually got there, is there?" the doctor asked. The archaeologist shook his head. "No." "And you're going to do all in your power to prevent us taking the remains of this creature?" the doctor continued. The archaeologist nodded. As he did, the doctor moved forward and with a lightning speed knocked the gun out of the archaeologist's hand with his umbrella. The doctor leapt forward and became entangled with the archaeologist. As they fought, the archaeologist's shirt was torn, revealing a medallion hanging around his chest. It was a similar medallion to those worn by the Fellowship in Victorian London, a worm curled around the globe. The gun had landed within a few inches of Blake. The poet picked it up and handed it over to the Time Lord. "Come on," said the doctor. Blake climbed into the cab, followed by the doctor. The archaeologist didn't move. "There is no escape," the archaeologist barked. The juggernaut started with a cough and splutter, was thrown into gear, and began to move off down the narrow road. The archaeologist ran in front of them and stood in the middle of the road. He wasn't going to move. The doctor threw the juggernaut into second gear and advanced. Still no move. The archaeologist had no intention of moving. As the truck was about to hit him, the doctor turned the steering wheel sharply and drove along the hedge, avoiding the cursing figure. Blake took a last look at the soldiers using high-powered explosives against the demons. It was a bloodbath, with few of the passengers still alive and the forces of order and reason badly outnumbered. Soon, all the passengers and soldiers would be dead. The archaeologist stood watching them with that fixed grin, staring into their souls. "Don't worry," said the doctor. The juggernaut was building up speed and, looking down, it was easier to see where the road was clear and safe to travel. The juggernaut passed uneventfully down the country lanes, back to the hole in space and time. Blake felt tired and sick. He found it difficult to see what progress had been made since his time. What was the future of the human race? He looked at the doctor, concentrating on trying to steer the mechanical transporter. He looked like he was enjoying it, although he kept making mistakes, forcing the juggernaut to shudder and shake to a standstill. "What is going to happen, Doctor?" Blake asked. "About what?" "The demons. They'll return back to their own world once they've had their fun. No one will ever acknowledge what's happened today. The Earth has been visited many times in its history, but it's all been covered up. The bodies of the victims will be burnt or lost," the doctor said, in a matter-of-fact manner. "And us? Just have hope." The juggernaut thundered through the countryside, returning to Salisbury Plain. The doctor found the porthole to the other world almost instinctively. He slowed the lorry down and ground to a halt. "You don't have to come," he said. Blake nodded, knowing there was no choice. "What's there?" he had to ask. "My past," said the doctor, putting the juggernaut into gear and driving into the hole. The journey was almost at an end. The dark castle lay within an hour's walk. Although Swarf indicated all was going according to plan, Chopra knew this was not true. He sensed the deadness paralysing the planet, could feel the chaos and destruction unfolding on the distant worlds of the Alphosian system. He could not tell if there was any connection between the events on this minor planet and those on the outer worlds. However, he knew of the sacred prophecies. The dark times were again descending over the universe. He didn't need to throw the stones. The message was the same, again and again. The collapse. Swarf stood over him. The dwarf wanted to move on. "I see beyond the veil of illusion," Chopra said. "No," Swarf replied. "You do not believe in the supernatural?" "No." "Then what do you think is the purpose of life?" Swarf changed the subject. "Tell me of my brother." "He is—" Chopra could think of nothing more to say. "Dead?" Swarf roared. "I'm sorry." "Then he failed, and I wasn't told." Swarf struck him across the face and grabbed the stones. He clenched his fist and crushed them. He threw the pulverized contents into the air. Chopra stared. His stones destroyed. How would he survive without them? The shape-changer grabbed Chopra's hair and pulled him off the ground. "I feel an emptiness," Chopra said. "You must beware. It is a paralysis spreading across this world." Swarf ignored him. "Where are the androids and the women?" "They are close by," Chopra spluttered. "I can feel one of the women and an android within a kilometre of our position. They are walking through the space station. I can see through her eyes. But they are not the enemy." The shape-changer dropped him onto the ground. He screamed, and his body was ripped open and transformed into a jet-black bird. "I will join you at the castle," I have some unfinished business. Nothing must stop us now." The bird squawked and launched itself skywards. Chopra watched the bird fly up to the heavens. Bernice still had a feeling of being watched. She was jumpy and had at one point been startled by her own shadow. She had the feeling that someone or something was watching her every movement. She remembered when she was younger and had received religious indoctrination at school. There was always this idea that people lived on in some form after death, looking after you. She had liked that idea, and thought somehow that her mother kept a watchful eye on her. "Hello again," said a voice. She looked up. She had wandered off again. Her mysterious saviour had returned. She felt close to him, although she couldn't quite see his features or his choice of clothes. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I don't know." She hadn't thought of a reason for her being here. She had followed the android, hoping that the doctor would reappear and save them. "I'm looking for the doctor." "The Time Lord?" "Yes. Did I tell you that?" The figure didn't reply. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I'm protecting you," he replied. "From what?" "The shape changer." She was puzzled. This wasn't the type of conversation she particularly enjoyed. "What are you talking about?" "Let me tell you about your journeys," the figure said. "Look, I'd rather not." "Spike!" she shouted out. "Listen, it's not that I don't trust you, but—" "Spike!" He can't respond. "Oh my God!" Bernice shouted, as it dawned on her what was going on. She ran down a corridor and another corridor. Why do all these corridors look alike? "Spike! Spike!" she shouted. And then she heard a noise. It sounded like a body being thrown against the wall. "Spike, I'm coming!" she shouted. She turned the next corner. She ran. Spike lay propped against a wall. A green liquid was pouring from his broken and battered body. He had been terminated. Standing over him was a lizard-like creature, dark green, 2 legs, Tyrannosaurus-featured head, and a huge tail which had inflicted most of the damage. The tail swung again and banged the android's head against the wall. Spike's head fell forwards and hit the floor. "What do I smell?" the shape-changer said, turning towards her. "You bastard!" she shouted. It looked at her. She was now the prey. Its body began to shuffle up the corridor towards her. She ran. She opened the first door off the corridor. Another door lay on the other side of the room. She ran over and pulled the door. It was locked and not budging. She pulled as hard as she could. Damn! She'd have to go back. She turned. It was there in the doorway, sprouting tentacles from its tree-like chest. It stepped through the door, and the tentacles started to slide along the walls towards her. She glanced around the room. It was empty, apart from a few chairs and a couple of tables. She had to defend herself somehow. She picked up one of the chairs. The tentacles were sliding closer to her. She wielded the chair in front of her, trying to parry the approaching menace. As the creature moved within 5 meters of her, she held onto the chair with both hands and ran straight at the creature's unprotected stomach area. However, instead of driving the chair into the lumbering reptile, which would stop her impetus, she sidestepped, jumped past the creature, and carried on running to the door. Back in the corridor she ran to Spike. He was dead. "Well, you're on your own now, girl," she thought. She looked down at the body and felt sadness. "Woman!" the thing shouted. She ran. Turning the next corner, she saw a hole in the roof where the sunlight was streaming in. Hearing the slithering sound behind her, she jumped up and pulled herself through the roof. It was a tight squeeze, and she tore her jacket. She lay on the roof looking through the artificial skylight. The creature was coming closer. As it moved beneath the hole, it stopped. And then she saw a strip of her jacket stuck on the jagged edge of the hole. The creature was right below her, and if it looked up, she would have to lean over. It's now or never. She stretched over and pulled the material off the torn metal. It turned towards the roof. She stared at it and held her breath. It wasn't moving. One of the tentacles began to move up and pushed through the hole. And then there was a sound from somewhere else in the space station. It hadn't seen her. The tentacle retracted quickly. The creature slithered away down the corridor. She saw the creature disappear, and she breathed again. After a few moments, she climbed down to the space station and ran off in the opposite direction to the shape-changer. "Check to you, but it's not mate. Not yet, anyway," Bernice said to herself.